This podcast is brought to you in partnership with EVA International Media Limited. Hello and welcome to Down to Earth with Terry Virch, where we talk about what matters down here on planet Earth. And today I'm very excited to have a returning guest, Nicholas Wade. Nicholas is a journalist who has written for publications such as the New York Times, Nature and Science, and others throughout his more than 4-decade career as a journalist. He recently testified about the lab leak hypothesis to the House Select Subcommittee on Coronavirus Pandemic. And by the way, I highly recommend listening to that testimony. Nicholas, where can people find that original testimony? I guess on C-SPAN or?
I think the testimony is listed on the House Subcommittee website.
Okay. It was really good. It was very succinct. And we're going to talk about that today. So can you talk a little bit about your background? Like what, as a journalist, you were mostly a science journalist, is that right?
Yes, I worked in science journalism all my life. I worked first on Nature and then Science. Those are two leading scientific research journals that have small news sections. And I went to the New York Times as an editorial writer. And then I went over to the news side where I was the science editor.
Okay. And is this, unfortunately, has become political and ideological, which is kind of the thing that I'm trying to take out of this. So you're not a political person or a political player. That was not, Nicholas Wade was a science journalist, not, a right-wing ideologue or anything like that.
That's right. I regard myself as sort of politically neutral and independent, and I have no strong political views.
Right. Unfortunately, the discussion of science immediately degenerates into that, and so I'm trying to get rid of that. So this topic about coronavirus, it was taboo, right? Like in the beginning of the pandemic, it was a conspiracy theory, and we'll talk more about that. And now all of a sudden, it's okay to talk about it. So what do you think changed?
Well, I don't know how the polarization began in the first place, which has always seemed to me totally absurd. I mean, this is or should be a purely scientific issue, and
right.
wherever people are on the political spectrum, presumably you would think they would want to understand where the virus came from. And yet, from the very first moments back in January 2020, the issue became sort of politicized. And if you were on the Democratic side, you favored a natural origin for the virus. And if you were on the Republican side, in increasing numbers, you would prefer the lab leak theory, that the virus escaped from a lab where it was being manipulated.
Right.
This polarization has persisted from the start. It's still in full force now with these House hearings led by the Republicans and opposed by the Democrats. And I just think it's an absurd way to run a country.
The most powerful country on the planet. It's absurd. Yes. Well, I think the problem was Trump. I mean, he said it was a lab leak, so immediately half the country believed him and half the country didn't believe him. And just put all the Donald Trump nonsense to the side. It's a science question, and that's what. Hopefully, let's talk about that today from a science point of view. So, I'd like to summarize it and see what you think, and then dive into your analysis that you shared in your testimony. So the big picture is there's this thing called the Wuhan Institute of Virology that amazingly enough is in Wuhan, China, which amazingly enough is where the pandemic started. US government money was going there at a small level to study viruses, which is not unusual at all. There's lots of science collaboration around the world. This is something that happens. There's a company called EcoHealth Alliance, I think that happened through, that Peter Daszak was running. Also, the U.S. consulate in 2018 had called out this specific lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, for being not quite up to speed with how they're taking care of these bio level 2 or 4 procedures. They weren't up to speed with their safety. By the way, his background, the Soviets had a leak in Sverdlovsk back in 1979 of anthrax that they vehemently denied because it was an illegal bioweapons is what they were doing. prominent US scientists went over to the Soviet Union and said, yeah, the Soviets are telling the truth. Their scientists are right. It was a natural origin. It wasn't a lab leak. And it wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union that it came out that it was a lab leak. Very similar, not the same, but a similar circumstance to Wuhan. The virus came out of the gate going human to human, which is unusual. And you can talk more about that. And they haven't found the virus in nature. So I think you might have said this, or somebody said this, that gun is not smoking, but it's really hot to the touch. Okay, so is that a good summary of kind of the overall? Oh, and by the way, it's the Chinese government, which covers up everything immediately, and is not open in any way. So that's kind of the summary.
I think that's a pretty good summary.
Okay. So you run through a case about why you think it might have been assembled and actually modified by humans. So either this thing came from nature straight to people, or maybe they were studying a natural virus and the natural virus leaked out on its own, or they actually modified it. Humans actually modified it. Those are kind of the three possibilities. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. And there's pretty good evidence for why it was actually modified in the lab. Can you talk through that?
Yes, the evidence is a tiny little bit of genetic material that has been added to the virus. It's just 12 nucleotide units long. It's called the furin cleavage site, and it sits in the middle of the gene for the virus's spike protein. And it's very important in allowing the virus to infect human cells. So the furin cleavage site is what makes the SARS-2 virus what it is, such a deadly virus for humans. And the reason why it sticks out so much is that SARS-2 is the only virus in its family. This is a subfamily of coronaviruses called sarbecoviruses. SARS-2 is the only sarbecovirus that possesses a furin cleavage site. And that is a reason for thinking it could have been put there in a lab rather than in nature, because in nature, viruses accumulate extra bits of genetic material, like the furin cleavage site, by swapping material with members of their own family. It's almost always within their own family. And so the fact that no other sarbecovirus has a furin cleavage site is a big red flag saying this may have been put there in a lab.
So these viruses, they get genetic material from each other. What's the process called when they both come together in the cell?
It's called recombination, and it happens when you get two viruses invading a cell at the same time, and they both hijack the cell's production machinery in the usual way. But when the time comes for them to reassemble themselves from the bits and pieces they've made, each virus's progeny gets put together with bits from the other virus. So they exit the cell being a sort of hybrid of the two viruses that entered it in the first place. So recombination is the only way you can get a big novel chunk of genetic material.
Okay. So, and there are furin cleavage sites in other viruses, but they're in such different families that they probably wouldn't recombine together.
That's correct.
Okay. And the furin cleavage site is what makes it so potent.
Yes. And scientists have been experimenting with furin cleavage sites, adding them to viruses for at least 5 years or so. So this was a recognized way of souping up a virus.
And the scientists wanted to study this, and I'm assuming that many of the scientists are good people interested in science, and they, these viruses are deadly. 2004, I think, was SARS-1, right? I mean, you don't want these diseases out there, so they're trying to do a good thing by studying them.
Yes, the theory is that we can get ahead of nature by going out into the wild, bringing these viruses back into the lab, seeing the few extra tweaks they need to become a serious human pathogen, and then that'll give us the knowledge to make vaccines against them and be prepared ahead of time. that's the theory. In practice, it just doesn't work that way. People don't make vaccines against viruses that haven't emerged yet because it's very expensive, and you've got no way of really predicting, which viruses are going to make the spillover. So it looks much more like a sort of a theoretical scheme to sort of keep virologists employed and to satisfy their curiosity and their power to manipulate nature.
Well, not only is it expensive, it could be dangerous. Worse than,
it's highly dangerous.
Yeah.
This category of research is called gain of function. So
Right.
the virologists like it because it sort of brings lots of funds into their labs. But in practice, the risks are limitless, are sky high, and the benefits so far at least have been zero.
So I don't want to pile on Fauci. I appreciate that he was trying to get people to get vaccinated, and I appreciate it that he was attacked horrendously for lots of really bad reasons. But he said that they weren't doing gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute. So first of all, it's a Chinese lab. They can do whatever they want, and we don't know what they're doing because it's a Chinese lab. Just because the US didn't fund something doesn't mean they weren't doing it. And second of all, there was reason that you talk about extensively to think that they kind of gave us a blueprint of what they wanted to do, right? But before the coronavirus pandemic came out, there was a grant proposal that was denied.
Right. I mean, I agree completely with what you say about Fauci. I don't understand the virulence with which he's being attacked from the right. All I know is his actions in this specific instance of the support of gain of function research in general and of research at the Wuhan Institute. So because gain of function is somewhat tricky to define, so I think when Fauci says he was not supporting gain of function, there's a lot of semantics in and I think you'll find a difference in the scientific community as to whether the precise experiments being undertaken there were gain of function or not. So, but laying that term aside, I think it is true to say that, in fact, there is no doubt that the Wuhan researchers were enhancing the capabilities of these viruses, and they were doing so in very low-level safety conditions. So it was, in brief, a sort of dangerous situation, which, if properly regulated, should not have been allowed to happen.
But was it 2018 that there was a request, hey, we want to do X, Y, and Z, and it was turned down because it was too dangerous? So they kind of gave us a map of what might have happened anyway, even without US funding?
Oh, yes. So there are two lots of grants going on. One is the grants that the Wuhan Institute got from Fauci's agency, the NIAID, which is part of the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. So those were two 5-year grants starting in 2014, as I believe. Now, the grant you're referring to is a quite different one. It was made 2018 to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And that grant is very important because it shows the kind of manipulations, of genetic manipulations, that the Wuhan researchers had in mind. Now, DARPA turned that grant down because it was too dangerous even for DARPA, but the researchers may well have found other funds to do it, or they may have done much of the work in advance of the grant, which is common practice. You want to be sure your grant proposal is solid, so you do a lot of the groundwork before you put the paperwork in. And what this grant shows is that the Wuhan researchers wanted to take the furin cleavage site and insert that into a bunch of coronaviruses. So this was the precise recipe for creating SARS-2, depending on what the starting viruses were. So now you see why the Chinese government closed down the big virus database that the Wuhan researchers operated in September 2019, suggesting they had reason at that time not to want anyone to know what viruses the Wuhan Institute was working on.
So that database, I could get on my laptop and log on and see it from US. It was not, you didn't have to be behind the firewall in Wuhan to see it. It was like available to the scientific community.
That's right. It was a scientific resource, and I think it was funded at least in part by NIH.
And then it shut down in September of 2019. But coronavirus didn't happen for a few months after that.
Well, that's right. So this suggests that this was the beginning of the epidemic.
Right.
That it began silently, as many epidemics do, and this was the moment at which perhaps researchers at the Wuhan Institute fell sick with a sort of strange new flu, and the Chinese authorities, with the SARS-1 epidemic of 2003 in the back of their mind, thought, well, let's not have a repeat of this, and actually, it would have been too late by then. They would have said, we're having a repeat of this. Let's shut down our database so no one can trace this back to a lab accident. And that's what it seems.
I remember at the time, Texas A&M does a exchange with Wuhan. Actually, my son went to medical school at Wuhan for the summer. That was his summer program as an Aggie. And there was a Chinese kid, a Chinese national student came back to Texas A&M. And in my brain, it was December of 2019 when he was sick. It was very early in the pandemic. So yeah, those dates, I don't know if I might be misspeaking here, but I do in my mind, I have that date in mind. So the Chinese are probably the best scientists on earth. They have a great scientific community. They have a great science program. We're focused on, was the NIH funding this or not? But China has money. They have scientists. They have equipment. This could have been happening independent of what the NIH knew was happening. Right? This is not our lab; it's their lab.
That's right. So the NIH funded just a small slice of what they were doing.
Right. There's so much to unpack here. First of all, I want to play devil's advocate, and I'll ask you to refute yourself, because not all scientists agree with what you're saying about the furin cleavage site. Is that right? What's the counter argument to what you're saying? Or is there a valid one?
I think what you can say is, well, we know of about 100 plus members of the sub-echovirus family, but there are lots more of them out there in nature. And if we look hard enough, we'll find one with a furin cleavage site. Okay,
so it might have happened evolutionary. Just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it didn't happen. That's the argument.
Right. The other thing is that, nature is always doing things that seem highly improbable to us, because we don't sort of understand all the permutations and commutations that the mutational process is going through. So recombination is sort of mostly, maybe almost entirely, between virus members of the same family, but maybe every so often you get one outside the family. So you can't say that having a furin cleavage site is a smoking gun. It's sort of strong circumstantial evidence that needs to be explained somehow or other.
Right. And the Chinese Communist Party is not going to explain it. They're just, if it were true that it leaked from the lab, we'll never know that as long as they're in charge, unless somebody very brave comes out and tells the truth. But that didn't happen in the Soviet Union for 13 years. So we have that data point.
We're going to have a complete stonewall unless, as you say, we have a whistleblower. But I think there is one possible exception to that sort of wall of pessimism, which is that there may be data in the files of the NIH or the EcoHealth Alliance in New York, which contains a report back from the Wuhan Institute, which, after all, they were obliged to do since this was their funding agency. And those reports may contain enough evidence for us to figure out what viruses they were working on. And if so, then we can pinpoint the origin of SARS-2. So I wouldn't give up hope yet that we might not attain pretty good proof that this was a lab leak.
Why has that data not been made public?
Well, it's because the wretched politicization of this issue that in the last Congress, the Democrat side, because they're committed to natural origin, blocked all attempts to have a sort of bipartisan inquiry with subpoena powers and obtain all these documents. In this Congress, where the last inquiry is getting underway under the aegis of the Republican side. So if we obtain these documents, we may be able to give a much better argument about the history of this program.
Wow. So subpoena power and getting to those data might or might not show some of the origin scientifically.
That's correct. After all, if you're a grantee of the NIH, you have to file voluminous progress reports on how you've done what you've been up to. So those reports should have gone back from the Wuhan Institute to the EcoHealth Alliance, and maybe from there back to NIH. This sort of paper trail is full of possibilities if we can lay hands on it.
Oh, wow. I hope that happens. I didn't realize that. So, and there's another scientific issue that we haven't talked about. When these viruses happen, for example, SARS-1 20 years ago, doesn't it's animal to human, animal to human, animal to human for some period of time before the evolution of the virus makes it human to human transmission. Is that right?
Yeah,
yeah.
That's exactly right. You see, when the epidemic first started, there was no good way of deciding between natural origin and lab leak, because on the one hand, we know there's sort of leaks from labs all the time, but on the other hand, viruses are sort of fairly often spilling over from wild animal populations to humans, and the SARS-2 epidemic you mentioned took exactly that route. It jumped over to an animal called civets, which is eaten in these Chinese wet markets where they sell sort of wild animal meat, and from civets to humans. And you can trace that whole process. You can see the virus sort of jumping to civets and then making an attempt to jump from civets to humans, all of which is very difficult for the virus because it has to make mutations constantly all the time to adapt itself to its new host. So it's like sort of 17 mutations to get from civets to first jump to humans, and then there are more mutations when the virus is inside humans for it to sort of go from being a sort of a mild infection to a deadly pathogen. You can trace all that in the environment, and the fact you can't see a single step of this for SARS-2 is a strong argument against the natural origin theory, in my view.
Has that ever happened before, to your knowledge? Has there ever been there's lots of viruses that come from nature, right? Has there ever been one that it was immediately human to human, or is there always this kind of intermediate waiting period?
I think there's almost always sort of several false attempts for the virus to make the transition. Not all these transitions go through intermediate animal hosts, and there are some viruses whose animal hosts in the wild we still are not really sure about. I think Ebola comes into that category, although bats are a suspect that hasn't been proved. So we don't know the natural reservoir of Ebola. But if you're talking about coronaviruses, the nearest precedent for SARS-2 is, of course, SARS-1.
What are pangolins?
So pangolins are sort of wild animals also kept in these wet markets, and they come into the story because when this story first broke with an email from 4 scientists led by Christian Anderson of Scripps Research, they sent an email to Fauci on January 31st, 2020, saying, we have unanimously concluded this virus cannot be explained on evolutionary principles, meaning essentially it's man-made. So a discussion group was then formed, which essentially had the goal of knocking down this theory. So we know that from the emails, because Anderson himself said, we've been trying to prove this isn't a lab leak. Now, what was needed at that stage to justify Anderson's almost immediate change of mind you needed new scientific data that he could point to and say, see, that's the reason I'm changing my mind 180 degrees.
This is a scientist at the NIH.
He's a scientist supported by the NIH.
A top guy, right? Okay.
In La Jolla.
Okay.
And he's the sort of central figure in this because he led this group of people who first looked at the virus and said, this is man-made.
And this is January 31st, 2020.
2020, yeah.
Right at the beginning. Okay.
Yeah. And he's important for a second reason because he then changed his mind and he published an enormously influential paper in Nature Medicine that said there's no way this could be a laboratory construct. So the big question is, well, what scientific evidence did he have to change his mind? Well, now the best scientific evidence would be finding a virus very similar to SARS-2 in a wild animal. And the Chinese, who may possibly have been in collusion with some of the scientists on this running conference, the Chinese announced that they had found a virus in pangolins that was 99% similar to SARS-2. And everyone at the conference said, well, this is the decisive piece of evidence, and we'll get busy writing this recantation paper, the one saying there's no way SARS-2 can be man-made. Now, the trouble is that the pangolin data that the Chinese produced has since turned out to be very much less strong than was presented at the time. To start with, the pangolin SARS virus alleged to be similar to SARS-2. It's not at all. It is in no way 99% similar. It's far less similar than that. It has no furin cleavage site. The pangolin sequences the Chinese said they have are in a very ropey state in terms of accuracy. One of them was so bad it never got published. So the pangolin data is just a gigantic distraction, it seems to me, from what actually happened. It was basically a failed attempt to justify Anderson's change of mind.
So this is the road to Damascus, when the Apostle Paul went from being a bad guy to getting converted on the road to Damascus. The scientists were converted. They saw the light.
Yeah, except it was the other way around, in my view.
Exactly. It was an anti-convert, right?
Darkness.
Well, so there's this group of scientists that are amongst themselves, and these emails came out through Freedom of Information Act, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, several different requests, bitterly resisted by the NIH all the way along. And the first documents the NIH produced were just blank sheets of paper, hundreds and hundreds of blank sheets.
Right. I've seen them, just black line, redacted.
Right.
Yeah. So basically internally, these top scientists were going, hey, this is weird. We haven't seen this before. And then all of a sudden, a few days later, and I forgot the exact quote from Fauci, but it was, we need international harmony or something like that.
I think it was Francis Collins, Fauci's boss,
okay,
and the head of the NIH. He said 2 days, just 2 days after the Anderson email had been received, he said this will do enormous damage to science and international harmony.
Right.
Which is such a strange thing for anyone to say. When given this information, you would think, let's investigate this as fully as we can. Let's inform all other agencies of government. But instead, they went the suppression path.
Yeah. And a lot of times it's not direct, do this. For example, Trump didn't say overthrow the election. He just said, we need to find 11,780 votes. A lot of times there's a self-censorship that's happening. And it was probably understood that if it comes out that the lab caused this virus somehow, that's going to hurt funding.
I think that's right. If you sort of try and put yourself in the mind of Anderson and his three colleagues when they sort of made this discovery, it was a big thing. They must have been very excited. They must have expected praise for having discovered the origin of the virus.
Right. Then
they discovered, to their amazement, that Fauci was not really very pleased with their discovery.
Yeah.
And the very next day, they're hauled up before this international committee with lots of European virologists who love doing gain of function research, who poke holes in their argument, and it soon becomes clear to them that they got the wrong answer. Maybe the right answer scientifically, but politically it was the wrong answer, and they changed their minds.
Can you talk about the Lancet, the journal, how important it is, who funds the Lancet, and who wrote that article that said that it's a conspiracy theory to say it's a lab leak? Can you talk about that? I think that was super important.
Oh, sure. So the campaign to persuade everyone that this was not a lab leak had two sort of legs. So one was the sort of scientific article written by Anderson and his colleagues for Nature Medicine saying this could not be a laboratory construct. And the other was a letter in the Lancet, which appeared somewhat earlier. And this was organized by Peter Daszak, who is the director of the EcoHealth Alliance in New York, through which the NIH channeled its funds to the Wuhan Institute. So Daszak organizes this letter. It's mostly full of rhetoric about how we're going to stand shoulder by shoulder with our Chinese colleagues. That any suggestion this is a lab leak is a conspiracy theory. This is a time when no one had even discussed the possibility of lab leak. They were trying to squelch the story before it even surfaced. And the two papers together were in retrospect extremely successful. But just back to the Lancet letter, the letter concluded by saying, we have no conflict of interest. And it failed to tell readers that, of course, Daszak had an enormous direct conflict of interest in that if the research that he had funded turned out to have leaked from a lab, obviously he would be on the hook to some extent.
And his company that depends on government funding, right, was funding the Wuhan Institute of Virology and had made that proposal in 2018 to DARPA. Was that right? Was that EcoHealth Alliance?
Yes, it was. That's correct. Which he never mentioned, by the way. He never told anyone about the 2018 proposal. And
that was discovered, right? That was discovered by you or by journalism that you had to dig to get that, right?
It was by a Freedom of Information Act request. I had nothing to do with it. I just wrote about it.
Right. Okay.
And I'm hesitating as to which organization specifically made the request. It may have been the U.S. Right to Know.
So in early 2020, right after the pandemic starts, there's this scientific paper that says, we're friends with the Chinese scientists. This happened naturally. This didn't happen in a lab. Of course, Trump is being Trump, who's ridiculous and saying all this stuff. And so let's all stick together and not believe all that right-wing propaganda. And the person who put it together, and Lancet is a well-respected journal, to say the least, right? Has some serious Chinese funding. Without Chinese funding, the Lancet doesn't have the articles that they need to publish. Is that true?
I don't know that for a fact.
Okay. I've read that. But
okay.
So the person that puts this whole it's a conspiracy thing together is himself getting funded and has himself actually proposed to do the exact research that could have potentially created coronavirus.
That's
and he said he doesn't have a conflict of interest.
Right.
This is like when I was at the Air Force Academy, we had ethics classes and they would teach us case studies of, this happened. Was it right or wrong? Or what should the person have done? This is a great, ethics case for 18-year-old cadets of what not to do.
Right.
Talk about the wet market. So, they have these wet markets in China, but a friend of mine who's a very good scientist, she's extremely qualified and very smart, sent me some data about how they could see that their origins of this happened at the wet market. Now, of course, it potentially happened several months before then. That it's probably started in 2019, but the data shows in early 2020, there's all these dots around the wet market. And you pointed out a lot of issues with that in your testimony.
Right. So the people who have a natural origin have been hanging their hat on these fairly new studies. I think they came out in October, November last year. And they argued that because all the early cases are dotted around the wet wet market. They're either in the wet market or very close around it. Therefore, the virus must have come from some animal in the wet market and had jumped naturally from bats to this intermediate animal to humans. So there are several problems with this thesis. So the first is that not a single animal in that wet market, when tested, was found to carry any virus. So this is the centerpiece of the hypothesis, that
Right.
you need an infected animal to make your argument that the virus went from bats to animals to humans. So there's no such animal.
Not only in the wet market, but in the wild. I mean, the Chinese government has a huge interest to find this. And
Right.
after SARS-1, they found it pretty quickly, and it's been 3 years of a global pandemic, and they still haven't found it in the wild or at the wet market.
That is true. But talking of the Chinese government, the second problem with this theory is that the Chinese themselves published at more or less the same time, headed by George Gao, who was then the head of their CDC. And this paper said, we tested 18 species of animal at the wet market. None of them was infected, and we need to keep on looking for the source of the virus. In other words, it did not conclude the wet market was the source of the virus. So if even the Chinese do not say the wet market was the source of the virus, I mean, you need to find some other kind of theory.
Even so, let's say there's a lot of different things that could happen. Let's say there was a scientist at WIV that accidentally got infected, didn't know it, went home, but now they have COVID. Well, they have to go grocery shopping. So he could have gone grocery shopping and started infecting other people at the wet market. Just because it happened at the wet market doesn't mean it came from an animal. It could have come from a human, hypothetically.
Yes, of course. And everyone agrees that the wet market was what we call a super spreader event, that lots of people got infected there.
Right.
But
so were weddings and bar mitzvahs and airplane flights. There were other any place where there's a lot of people could be a super spreader event.
That's correct.
Right. Would it have been just from one animal? Would there have been one bat only that had coronavirus, or would there have been a population of bats that had it?
Well, that's a very good line of thought, it seems to me. At each of these stages, you need sort of lots of animals, a very large population of host bats, and they need to infect a quite large population of intermediary animals.
Right.
Need to be in abundant contact with humans, and those are the conditions you need to get this kind of virus transfer rolling. And we don't really have any of that. The Chinese have sampled all the sort of commonly sold animal species at wet markets without any success. I think they tested 84,000 animals, something like that. No one's found that the host bat population, there's just sort of no leg of the natural origin hypothesis that has held up. There
was a WHO, I believe, investigation, a group that went over in 21, maybe 22, 21, to do an investigation. Talk about who was on that panel and the access that they had. And, we sent our Nobel Prize to the Soviet Union, who came back and said, hey, the Soviets are telling the truth in 1986 about the anthrax leak. So can you talk about the WHO investigation?
Well, the investigation was heavily controlled by the Chinese, who have acquired enormous influence at WHO, and they vetoed all the American suggestions for participants. Mr. Dashak was on the committee, along with European virologists who sort of favor gain of function research, and the Chinese sort of led them by the nose around Wuhan, didn't let them see anything, and more or less sort of negotiated what the conclusion was going to be, which was, this is almost certainly a natural virus, and it's ridiculous to raise questions of lab leak. Mm-hmm. So that's what happened. It was a very successful propaganda exercise by the Chinese from one perspective. But then after the committee sort of issued its finding, the other shoe sort of dropped as people read the report and realized that the Chinese had not given the committee one single piece of evidence in favor of natural origin.
Right.
So you could see that the natural origin theory had no clothes.
The problem is, Nicholas, that, and this is propaganda in general, it works. If the government yells from the tallest mountain that this is what's happening, a lot of people will believe it. Even though if you dig in and you make the effort to learn what's happening, you can see that it's all wrong, but the damage is done. And we're seeing that in Ukraine. The Russian government is extremely good at information warfare. And lots of people around the world believe their propaganda, even though it's clearly wrong. And then in this case with the Chinese government, I think we can see I hate to say Chinese, it's Chinese Communist Party. We need to be clear that's running things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is a case of propaganda works, which is really, it's a much bigger issue than just coronavirus, I think.
Yeah, and it's very depressing. I mean, you have to ask,
yeah,
why did our science journalists let us down? Why were they hoodwinked for so long?
Well, that's not so hard. Why did the man who was getting money to do this, who had everything to lose and things to gain, say one thing? That in that case of the American Peter Daszak, that you can understand why. But you're right. There are lots of other scientists are like, they're trustworthy. They're focused on science.
I think there are lots of elements that went into this, and the scientific community as a whole is very easily cowed, and it's because of their dependence on federal grants, which are handed out by these little peer review committees of scientists. They're not government scientists; they're from universities. But the problem is, if you get a single vote against you when your grant comes up to a peer review committee, then you don't get funded.
Right.
So every scientist is very careful not to make any political statement or say anything that might cause some other scientist at a distant university to know his name and have an adverse opinion of him and vote against him. So that's why scientists, many of whom must have thought from the very start that lab leak was a possible explanation, they just kept their heads down and said nothing and let the lie have time on its own wings to fly, as the saying goes.
Right.
And the same goes for the mainstream press that has failed even to this day to give a convincing account of lab leak.
That's why I have you on the podcast, and thank you for coming. So all 5 of my listeners can understand. Hopefully it'll be many more than that. At the end of the day, well, I want to talk about why it matters, but it's that the failure to just be open and honest and to have these political propaganda kind of, not guardrails, but to frame this in a political way when it should just be a scientific way is insane. And, lab leaks, I don't know if it was intentional. Were they engineering a bioweapon to try and take over the world? I don't think so. I don't know. Was it just an accidental? Maybe it was just a natural virus that accidentally leaked. That might have happened too. More likely, I think what you were saying, they were probably tinkering with it when it leaked. But lab leaks happen, right? I mean, in SARS, there's been several documented cases in China of viruses leaking from labs. They probably leak from American labs. I mean, no lab it's nature. Nothing's perfect. And lab leaks are something that just happens sometimes.
Oh, they happen all the time. It's very hard to guard against them. Scientists don't like working in high safety conditions. They tend to set the safety conditions too low. So we know that there's at least probably 1 or 2 sort of serious incidents in the world, every year, with many more that get covered up and we don't hear about. Right. So I wouldn't say they don't happen every day, but at the same time, they're not totally rare either.
Ebola has leaked. SARS-1 has leaked. Anthrax has leaked from the Soviet Union. I mean, right, they happen. So it's not crazy. It's not crazy to say that the lab that was studying coronaviruses leaked out a coronavirus where the coronavirus pandemic started. That's not a crazy thing to say at all.
Absolutely.
And yet the propaganda machine makes you sound like a conspiracy theorist, and that undermines people's trust in science, which is hugely damaging, I think.
Well, I think it will do if we come to a consensus as a nation that this was a lab leak. Then I think people are going to look back and they ask, why did the scientists not speak up? Why did the press not speak up? Why did so many of our institutions let us down?
The damage here is going to be profound. And so why does it matter? Why does it matter if it was a lab leak or not? You talked about this a lot in your testimony. It matters a lot, but what's the case for saying that this is a big deal? This matters.
Well, if you look first at the Chinese government, and if it was a natural occurrence, they can say, this is an act of God. We're not responsible for it in any way, or for any of the pain the epidemic has caused around the globe. If, on the other hand, it was a lab leak, then the Chinese government is responsible for having conducted research in unsafe conditions and having piled onto that mistake by conducting this cover-up for 3 years now. I think it matters from the point of view of the press, as we've just mentioned. The press has sort of joined in the idea that it's conspiracy theory to say the virus may have leaked from a lab, and has said so pretty persistently for 3 years, and has failed to present the evidence on the other side in a fair way or a full way, it seems to me. And they need to do some introspection too and say, why did we behave in such a herd-like way? Why did we not stick to the basic principles of journalism and handle both sides of this issue fairly until we could see where the truth lay? Those are two of the principles. And the third, of course, is a very important one on what do we do scientifically, because there's a large program of people who go into the wild and hunt viruses and bring them back to their lab. That program needs to stop, or at least be regulated in a different way. Whereas if it was lab, it was lab leak. If it was not, if it was a natural origin, then these virologists can continue to beat the bushes for dangerous viruses and continue to bring them back to their labs.
I totally agree. And the Chinese missed out on an opportunity. They could have said, hey, this virus leaked out of our lab that was funded by America. So this joint Chinese-American program, let's work together. And I think that the outcome would have been a lot different. Instead, they went full Chinese Communist Party mode, cover up everything. Trump went Trump mode to blame everybody and talk about how great he was. And it was just a complete disaster. Had both sides behaved in an adult way, I think the pandemic would have still happened. Once that genie's out of the bottle, you're not going to stop it. But I think it could have been handled a lot better. And probably a lot less people would have died in my mind.
I think that's a great analysis. The Chinese could have said, hey, this happened on our territory. We're sorry we let the virus out, but it was an NIH program. We were following NIH rules, and let's both us and the US conduct a full, open, joint investigation into how this happened. They would have been so much better off, and so would everyone else.
Yeah. So you think that the scientific procedures need to change? I don't know how we're going to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable. I don't think that's going to happen. In the press, how are you going to change the press? I mean, those are kind of the big things that need to change. The question is, how do we make those happen?
Yes, indeed. First one's the easiest. If we have a consensus that this was a lab leak, then I think it will sort of follow fairly easily from that we need to review all gain-of-function research, set up better ways of regulating it. The NIH should not be allowed to regulate the research it supports. There should be an outside, independent, objective regulator. Mm-hmm. There should be very strict limits on enhancing the infectivity of viruses. All that's fairly straightforward. How do you make the press behave in a less herd-like way on controversial issues and let themselves be hoodwinked by the sort of great distraction of making something political? This is where the politicization is so important. It distracts people from looking at the scientific facts. Right. And I think it may well have, I think this issue may well have been deliberately politicized in various ways. So it's very hard for editors, especially dealing with scientific subjects, which they sort of tend not to like or understand very well, to sort of keep a level head and say, We won't make any judgments on this until we know all the facts on both sides. That's what journalists are meant to do. They're meant to be objective and neutral and dispassionate,
and skeptical.
But given human nature, they are not. And they're thinking about how do we make a headline the next day? How do we compete with our papers? Let's not get out on a limb or say anything controversial, unless we're sure of it. Of course, you don't have to do that if you're just following the facts. If you're just putting the facts out there, no one is going to blame you. But I know this requires just a rethink. I think a return to the days when our press was less political and less partisan. A return to the idea that sources of information should be as neutral, unbiased as possible, and not compete with Twitter and the social media for sort of in your eyes headlines. It just requires a whole different mindset, which I hope we somehow achieve.
Yeah, it's super important. A free press is super important. That's a whole nother podcast about the status of journalism, that you need subscription revenue and you need ad revenue to pay for good journalism. The Lancet is depending on Chinese funded research to publish Chinese papers in their publication. There's a financial interest there, and the key is to remove that, that financial interest. So support your local journalism. I'll say that to the to the folks here. And the other thing is, I know scientists, I know how they think. They're not political. They trust each other. They want to do the right thing. They want to do science. These American virologists know the Chinese virologists. They studied together. The Chinese probably studied at our universities, and they want to trust them and believe them and not bring politics into it. Look, I'm a NASA guy. I've been very critical of NASA for still flying Russian cosmonauts on our spacecraft and for flying our astronauts on their spacecraft. Sometimes you need to back away and understand that there is a political universe out there that may not be doing the right thing. Amongst your own little small group, you may be friends and you may have the right motivations, but the Chinese Communist Party doesn't. And you just need to open your eyes. We need to pull our head out of the sand, I think.
Oh, yeah, I think that's right.
How was your testimony? How was it received?
I don't know how it was received. I mean, I was attacked from the minority side.
Really? From the Democrats?
Right, because they are institutionally in favor of natural origin. It's very hard to know what impact a testimony has.
So the Republicans were praising you, and the Democrats were attacking you, really?
Right.
What were they saying?
Well, they ignored my testimony entirely, I assume, because they couldn't fault it, and attacked me for a book I wrote 10 years ago, when when information first started to stream out from the Human Genome Project about human variation across the globe, or what we call racial variation. I thought it was important to write a book to explain the biological basis of human race, to show that there was no basis whatever for racism or thinking one race was superior to another, and to put that whole subject in context in a responsible way before anyone else tried to hijack the data. So I wrote what I think is a very good book about race. I'm very proud of it. It is anti-racist. It's good scientific explanation. But the trouble is, there are a large number of academics who are trying to persuade others, I'm sure they don't believe it themselves, that there is no biological basis for race or indeed for sex. They're trying to sort of oust genetics from existence, so far as I can see. So these academics and those who follow them will attack any book that talks about race, even in a non-racist way, and especially a book like my own, which describes the biological basis of race, which they want everyone to believe doesn't exist. So that has been the constant sort of background of my book. No one appreciates what I was, or very few people seem to appreciate. I was trying to explain race, not to in any way to imply one race was superior to another. Nonetheless, the minority on the committee sort of honed in on my book and the various attacks that have been made on it by these know-nothing obscurantist scientists, and
Right.
they used all their question time to berate me instead of to ask a single question about my testimony. So it wasn't a very uplifting insight into the way Congress governs, I'm afraid.
They were just looking for a soundbite. God, that's just, it has nothing to do with coronavirus.
Yeah, the whole system, it seems to me, is totally absurd. Each member
Yeah.
sort of 5 minutes to question a witness. So on both sides, they take their first 3 minutes to sort of make some soundbite about whatever, and then there's a couple of minutes left to question the witness. And how can you sort of bring out anything interesting or follow any line of inquiry? It's just sort of political showboating, and
Yeah.
I just don't know how we function under that system. It
Well,
seems dysfunctional to me.
Yeah. One of many reasons why I haven't run for Congress. There was another book some Harvard guys wrote, I think, Bell Curve. It was a few years ago. Anyway, if you mention the word race, you're going to be attacked. It's just awful.
Right.
How can you say there's no biological basis for sex? There's X and Y, or it is the foundational thing. Like everything else comes from that. And I mean, people around the world look different. It doesn't mean they're morally different, but like obviously there's biological reasons for this stuff. It doesn't just randomly happen. So anyway,
of course, because every child has the same race as his or her parents.
Of course, it's not. It's biology is what it is. It's so anyway.
And what we have here is the encroachment of politics into science. I mean, it's just like when the church tried to suppress Galileo. We have the invasion of critical race theory, or critical theory, I think it's called, into biology, saying there is no genetic basis for sex differences. They're all social constructs, and the same for race. It is totally absurd, and yet it sort of persists without anyone just laughing it into the ground.
Yeah. We need to get our act together, because the authoritarians of the world don't have to worry about this nonsense. The one man who's in charge of the country makes decisions. And yeah, we need to get this. In the case of coronavirus, it killed millions of people. It destroyed the global economy. So it matters. And we need to try and get the word out, for people to think critically about it, to use wisdom and discernment, and not just believe their whatever their side of the aisle says, but to open their eyes and let's make smart science-based decisions, not just ideology-based decisions.
That's right. I entirely agree.
Yeah. Well, Nicholas, thank you so much for coming on. This was really a good refresher. You were on, it's been, I think, over a year, but things have changed. And thank you for your testimony, for opening yourself up to getting attacked for some book unrelated that you wrote 10 years ago, because the truth really matters. This isn't just like a hypothetical college class thing. This is like global pandemic, and we need to focus on fact and truth, and not ideology.
Well, thanks, Terry, so much for having me back. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks for having us. And if you love the podcast, by the way, please give us a rating and subscribe. Thank you.